Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and hello online. And hello with a special hello to Carolyn Ellis Arthur Bochner. And thank you so much for joining us. Could you maybe pin them for us, Jamie, if that's possible, so we can get you massively on our big screen here at the front. Thank you for joining us. How are you both?
We're good.
We're good.
Doing well. We're a little warm here, but not as warm as you are.
Is that the first time you've ever said that to a British person?
From Florida,
Absolutely,
yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I think everyone here probably who has written and published autoethnography is aware of your work, and I would maybe speculate has probably referenced you, and you've been hugely influential to my work and my life because of it. So there's a real joy to see you both looking so well and so glamorous, if I might say so as well. Retirement is obviously the place to be at the moment.
Yes, indeed.
So our conference has had the theme and the title of Right to Roam. And we thought about right in two different ways, spelt with an R and a W. So writing, which is right in the heart of your work, and the right to actually go forth and think and act in ways that often our culture doesn't approve of or endorse. And so I asked a few people, if you were in a room with Carolyn and Art, or you had dinner with them, what sort of conversation would you like to have? And David Cardler said, well, I'd like to know, how does roaming connect with your autoethnographic practice, both of you? So I wonder, can we start with the conversation? Would either of you just reflect on that to get us going?
Okay, I'll start. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think, of course, roaming is very important in terms of writing, but in terms of the right to roam as well. And you didn't ask me about, my life particularly now, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, because it's what's on my mind, which is I feel some movement from right, W-R-I-T-E, to the R-I-G-H-T, right to roam. And I feel like that's a big part of autoethnography, to kind of roam around, take it all in, listen to all the voices in your head, roam through them, roam through your emotions, roam through the world, roam through the neighborhood, roam up and down the mountains, and just give yourself the freedom to think and feel and figure out what it is that you want to think about and concentrate on at the moment. And I think that throughout most of my life, I haven't allowed myself to roam as much as maybe I should have, because I was focused on my career or the specific event or feeling that I wanted to convey. And I have spent the last 2 years in retirement, which is truly wonderful. And I'm happy to report I'm not exhausted, as most of you are, thankfully. Doesn't mean my life isn't full of, problems and hassles and so forth, but I'm not exhausted in the same way that you are. And I have not been writing so much. I mean, I write things down, but I don't finish them. I've given myself permission not to finish them, not to publish them, but to really just participate in as much of the world as I can possibly participate in, trusting that at some point I will be moved to try to capture this in some kind of writing. But there is a way for me right now where the world and my life, it feels too big to capture. I don't know where I would start or where I would hope to end. And so I've decided that this is a time where I have the right to roam, and I am roaming from having meeting neighbors as we walk to going to neighbors' houses and finding myself smoking dope with a couple of 80-year-old Republicans, one who is terminally ill. Contrast that with the next day going to a Democratic meeting where the Democrats are training us to registered Democrats, and just like trying it all and seeing what I can learn and take in and figure out, what I might have to offer at this point in my life.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carolyn. Art, I can see that you're just full to bursting about with some ideas. Well, Caroline sparks you off, doesn't she?
I love the word roaming because it sort of describes my whole life as not only as a person, but as an academic, as I roamed through and across the human sciences and the many disciplines. And I was inspired recently to write a eulogy for a dear old friend of mine who was like my faculty mentor when I got one of my first academic positions at Temple University. And what I remembered about best about our relationship was we had this Thursday night, I guess you'd call it, conversation group that would meet at his house. He was already a senior professor when I was a young assistant professor. And there were 4 or 5 of us who met every week or two. And we came in from different disciplines: American studies, English, anthropology, communication studies, psychology. We didn't know each other's disciplines all that well, but we had a lot to talk about. And our mission evolved over time to be, how can we describe good conversation? What is a good conversation? What makes it good? Recently I've written in a few places about, I've used the line, talk is the kiss of life. Conversation is the kiss of life. And when I think about autoethnography, I think about conversation. I think about connection. I think about the other and the other's influence on the self. And I also think back to that very influential period of the 1980s and early 1990s during the narrative turn, the evolution of postmodernism and post-structuralism and its influences on our work. Richard Rorty's ideas about how much we need different ways of describing ourselves, and to be able to imagine different ways of living with ourselves. I think that's a lot about what autoethnography does. It helps us to imagine different ways of living with ourselves and our experiences as we move through this chaotic world. And the other initial thought, at least, that I have about roaming, and I think of David when I think of this in particular, was the profound influence of music on me in the 1960s and 70s. Listening to Bob Dylan and Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen. And we use, as you know, evocative as a sort of descriptor and objective of our work. and how evocative that music and that time was, and its influence in my life, because I think, and again, I think of this in terms of autoethnography as well, it allowed me to imagine myself in different ways, their music. And even to today, still listening to some of that music. It stimulates my memory and my imagination about different ways of being. And that's what evocative work to me is all about: connection, conversation, relationship. And I guess I can stop there.
Thanks, that. I love that. That is a wonderful thing to bring into our work, the imagination. And I know David and I have often had conversations about, often when we hear people's lives, things can be pretty bleak. So we need our imaginations to find ways forward from where we are at the moment into something else. So how might we, you mentioned music, art, Carolyn, how might you think about new ways to imagine things? Are there any things that you've used as a tool to provoke your imagination?
Well, in the past, the writing has always been what I use to evoke my imagination. But I do find now that I don't want to constrain my world to sitting in front of the computer.
Yeah.
I mean, I still do that a lot, but I just want to experience the world. And I find nature, I mean, nature is amazing to stimulate the imagination. And, we are so fortunate to have this place in Florida with a huge garden with paths. And so my imagination gets stimulated every single morning when I walk out with my cup of coffee and around, and I look at everything and each little bud and what's happening, and then put my coffee down and pick up the tools and start carving and fixing. And we moved from here then to North Carolina to the mountains, and that's a whole different terrain, but to be walking in nature, to breathe the air, to just be, not turn the mind off so much, but just to let all your senses engage all of them. And it's a cliche, but it's still so true, to just be here in this moment right now and experience, all the joy that you can possibly experience. And that tunes my imagination. And it also kind of gets me ready for the rest of the world, for trying to be there for other people, for trying to deal with all the chaos of the politics and the viruses and aging and body stuff, like Jonathan talked about so well. And so it really is, for me at this point, nature and conversation. Of course, to me, good conversations just stimulate my imagination. And we have a couple of former students who live in the neighborhood are near us, and they come over to visit. And just Sunday, we were having a huge conversation about spirituality. So I resonated with the session on spirituality that I saw earlier. And then I'm just full of ideas and stimulated after those kinds of conversations. So conversation in nature.
Yeah.
You want me to respond to that?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I also, of course, I dwell a lot, and I don't know if this is just endemic to my age or also probably to autoethnography as a whole. So much of my interest in autoethnography arose during a time when I was taking care of my mother toward the end of her life. And she was descending into dementia and Alzheimer's. And we spent a lot of time talking with each other. I recorded a lot of conversations between us. And that got me really interested in memory. And I think memory is one of the things that we're quite aware of when we write and or perform autoethnography. But it isn't necessarily, at least in my mind, an aspect of autoethnography that people sufficiently dwell on, you know, the various ways in which memory is impacting our work and how we think about memory. The old ways of thinking about memory were, you know, akin to a computer file. You just call it up and there it is, you know, just as it was when you put it away. But of course, memory isn't like that. And I like to think of what calls me to certain memories. Because memory, at least the way I look at it, is always a connection between the present, what's calling me to certain memories, and whatever memory I'm dwelling in at that time. And I like Mark Freeman's way of talking about memory as going to a place and dwelling in it, and allowing it to evolve and emerge. And so I think it's really, really important in our work to put memory a little more centrally. Storytelling is very much evident in almost all forms of autoethnography. But memory is sort of there, and there seems to be a fear of touching it because we might get burned, because it doesn't fit with the old views of empiricism and truth-telling in that way.
I remember,
yeah.
I remember Carolyn, a few years ago, your work with Jerry Welwicki, and you were saying his place memory and how important that was traveling with him.
Yes, yes. Do you want me to talk about that?
Not necessarily, but I was just, I'm just, as Art's talking there, it's prompting my memory of some of your work and how you talked about memory. And, you know, for both of you, you talk, Art, about what calls me, and Carolyn talked now about trusting your feelings to know what to write about, and you don't really want to write about everything, and you don't want to spend all day in front of the computer, and you don't want to worry about the next manuscript. And the flip side for many of our community is they are thinking about the next paper, they are thinking about the next project, they do have a deadline, and that is kind of a constraint. So would you talk a little bit, or, you know, reflect on your experience of how you negotiated those things, and any advice that you can give for people to who feel the pressure to write and to publish, but recognize that if they just trusted themselves, they might not be rushing to write?
Oh, that is a real hard one, because I can't, you know, I have to think about the context that we are currently in. And, you know, Art and I say all the time, we retired at the right time, because when I see the pressure on everyone in the academy, I just feel so much empathy, because I know how much pressure I felt and put on myself, you know, the 40 years that I was in the academy, and felt the pressure from the institution, but also felt the pressure from myself, and that sense of, you know, that we had something important to do here, and we needed to put all our effort into doing it. And so I know that so many people now feel some of those pressures of all those types. And then in addition, that pressure to, live in a world that's in such chaos at the moment. And it does feel like the most chaotic time that I have experienced. Of course, then my mind goes to, well, civil rights, et cetera, and that was a very chaotic time, but I was so young then that I don't think I experienced the chaos in quite the same way as I experience now. And this chaos gets associated with a sense of hopelessness for so many of us for so much of the time. We're back with like civil rights. There was this hope that things we're doing this to make things better. And now, at least in the US, we're kind of debating, what is going on and what is going to happen and trying to keep hope alive. So that's the problem. Now you want me to talk a little bit about how to handle all that. I can tell you the way I handled it was to just decide that there were certain categories of things that I just was not going to put my whole soul into. And so that I had time to do what I really felt passionate about, which was the writing and the development of autoethnography and narrative and a sense of caring and love in the academy. I mean, that was very important to me. And so that meant that I didn't do a lot of service to the university. My automatic response was no. And then, prove to me I need to do this. So I don't know if that works for everybody, but it worked for me. It at least gave me a little space so that I didn't just feel totally overwhelmed all of the time. And get yourself a partner who can understand your life and, work with you. I mean, I think that really made a lot of difference. Oh, and get a dog or a cat too. That helps.
Yeah, Carolyn and I led a very privileged life. I mean, I have to call it as it is. When we met in 1990, I was a full professor and chair of a department, and Carolyn was a tenured associate professor, moving up rapidly. But we didn't have the fear and maybe loathing that is experienced so much among younger faculty today. And I have to confess to a certain amount of guilt that I experienced of what was happening in the late 1980s and into the 1990s when forces of power divorced from us were beginning to take over universities and reduce the rights of faculty, and faculty senates, which were very powerful in the 1970s and 1980s. Unions, we had a union at Temple during the decade that I was there that was very influential and powerful, and the administration really had to answer to the faculty. And that started to disappear, and we were all too busy to pay attention to it, especially senior professors like ourselves. And we had our own agendas. I think what we've seen in the last 10, 15, even 20 years is the gradual loss of power and rights and privileges across the board among faculty. The idea of teaching, 4 or 5 courses in a research university and publishing and doing service and it didn't exist especially in research universities. Yes, I have a lot of pain in relation to, what was once an idealistic, loving job, position. We didn't even think of it as a job or even a career. It was just a way of life. And that's disappeared. And, I think those who remain in senior positions have to somehow collectively get a grasp of it and speak out and speak loudly, because I think the whole, way of life is in danger. I don't know how you continue, for example, graduate programs, when the expectation of having even a decent salary and capacity to live on is disappearing. It's distressing. It's really distressing. And then even, and I'm so glad you have a component of face-to-face, live, in-person conversation, because, even this, had I said some of these things in a public meeting surrounded by 50 or 100 or 150 people, the room would be buzzing, and people would be talking to each other and saying, what can we do? And let's unite. And now we're kind of limited to the screen so much.
Yeah.
And those things concern me. And even, and going back to your theme of roaming, the privilege of roaming.
Yes.
The right, and that's a good word. The right to roam is being stripped away.
Yeah, absolutely.
I fear.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm mindful of the time, but I just would like to ask you one more question, maybe, or maybe two. Or so, if you are still creative and you're still writing and you are moved to write and you're trusting yourself, Carolyn and Art, what are the things that you are doing then that is nailing your fingers to the keyboard and provoking you to address them? What's calling you now?
Well, probably it would be no surprise that, I spend most of my time thinking and writing about issues of aging and in a chaotic world, and where they intersect, and how to do it the best that I can do it, and perhaps offer something that would be helpful to other people in the aging process.
Thank you. Yeah.
So that's really what has captured me. I tried to write about COVID, and of course we gave that keynote for you last year, which we haven't yet, finalized. But COVID itself it feels too big to me. So what I think I can do is write about my own position within this universe at this particular point in time, at this particular age, and what it feels like and how I experience it, and cope, because I think the coping part of it is very important.
What about you, Art? What are you writing about?
Well, before I say something quickly about that, I want to speak to what Carolyn just said, because Carolyn wrote what I consider to be a really important and beautiful piece, and published it in her revision of Final Negotiations, which was published a couple of years ago by Temple University Press. And it's kind of gotten lost, during COVID. A lot of books weren't being promoted, but it's the final piece in that book, in the second edition of Final Negotiations. And it's about this, this question that you bring up, what's worth doing now, and how do you experience the aging process? And I highly, highly recommend that piece. I think it's really a beautiful piece. In terms of myself, a few years ago, quite a few years ago now, in a kind of offhanded way, in a very political setting, in which we were struggling to get an ethnography division in the National Communication Association. I said in an offhand way, to try to muster votes, that ethnography, the association didn't like having divisions that were methodological. So I couldn't think of anything else to say. So I said, well, ethnography is not a method, it's a way of life. And more recently, in the last few years, I wrote a piece that was published in the Ethnography Journal, talking about autoethnography as a way of life. And that's what I'm working on, because I think some of the practice of autoethnography, Jonathan's piece was a good example of it, is exemplary of autoethnography as a way of life. Yes, it has methodological meanings and practices and so forth, but it's also a way of being in the world. It addresses kind of that question of how to be, to enable yourself to stay alive. And so that's what I've been working on in a variety of short pieces, but I envision something bigger than that as it continues. And I think all of you are contributing to that, because I look constantly for evidence in the autoethnographic literature of just how even though there are certain requirements to publish, with citation and this and that, but how so much of autoethnography is an exemplar of a way to live, and may really have been rooted in one of the biggest influences of my young life many years ago was Gregory Bateson and the idea of meta-communication. And I think the autoethnographic way of living is a kind of meta-communication.
That's wonderful. We had the session before Jonathan's looked at the spirituality and roaming, and there was a vicar that joins our autoethnography group every year, and his presentation was wonderful, and what you've just said really, and how we use this to help understand our life. And he said theologians actually need autoethnography. He said that's missing from the curriculum, and when he found it, it was really meaningful for him.
We, our good friend and former student Shaba Aswath, which you may have heard him do a presentation, but he's also a minister in a church which happens to be in our little town in Florida. So we get to see him often, and he often comes over and we have a conversation about something that happened in our lives. Or one day he met my sister, who has a whole conversation about her belief in God and so forth. And he then takes these, writes an autoethnography, and that becomes his sermon each week. These different experiences. So he has certainly coordinated the two.
That would be lovely to read some of his work. We were discussing it, that it's been that particular subject is often missing in autoethnography. People still think stay away from religion in politics and all the tentacles that come down from that.
Yeah, that was a very interesting discussion that you had earlier, I thought.
Yeah.
And I also want to add here, because I think we're probably running out of time, what a privilege it is for us to be here with you all today, and how honored.
I'm going to draw this like. Oops.
And thanks to you, Katrina, for holding this conference and all the organizing that goes into it. I mean, just what a wonderful event, really.
Well, what I find amazing is you two have been one of the catalysts for this work. And I can't, we talked about imagination a minute ago. I can't imagine and keeping it rolling. And now, I remember whenever I've heard Norman Denzin, he's always talked about, right, you lot, you've got to keep it going, because look at, we started this. And I think the people in this room, from what I've heard over the last few days, your legacy is in good hands.
We feel that. We certainly feel that. Yeah.
Definitely.
So thank you so much for being the last session here. And I look forward to when we meet physically.
We will too.
yes.
Lots of big hugs. We can't
Thank
wait.
you.
Thank you.